The Stono Rebellion of 1739. I chose the Stono Rebellion for this first episode for the simple fact that I live in South Carolina, and the history that we are about to discuss is not some abstract concept. It's not something that is far away from you. Anyone who's ever visited here, I'm very sure you're aware of the preponderance of plantations that are still here. And just for context, even by my job, there is a cemetery for enslaved and freed people, and it's literally like 5 minutes away from where I work. So this history isn't something that is far away. Some idea out in the ether of something that happened is very present, and it's very close. And another reason that I chose this is because I am married to a Charlestonian, who is also a member of the Gullah Nation, and we're going to be talking about them later on. So, in another episode. So this history is important to me, and I think the Stono Rebellion does not get the attention that it deserves. And to begin, we can't discuss rebellion without first discussing the Ma'afa, which is the name given to the transatlantic slave trade, which is also known as the African Holocaust. In 1482, the Portuguese built a fort on, I want to say, the west coast of Ghana that came to be known as Elmina Castle. And it was a place which would also become the last stop for kidnapped Africans as they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas and what is now the Caribbean. I think that it's important to note that, yes, Africans did supply Europeans with people to enslave. No one has ever disputed that fact that I know of. But I think it's really, really important to make the distinction that the form of enslavement that existed in Africa is very, very different than what existed in the Americas. And the people who were supplying people to the Europeans, I would argue that there was no way they could have conceptualized the level of horror and dehumanization that awaited their people on this side of the world. Anyone who has, looked into the way that enslavement existed in many countries on the continent knows that it was more like a system of indentured servitude. People who were enslaved in African cultures were expected to be fed properly and clothed properly. They were expected to be given an education. Many times they were able to marry into the families that held them, in bondage. It wasn't indefinite, and it certainly did not transfer to their children. It was not predicated on the color of their skin. So there are some very, very fundamental differences between the form of enslavement that existed in Africa versus the enslavement that existed in what came to be understood as the New World. And also, let's be clear, enslavement is wrong, period. I don't think I need to say that, but let's understand that enslavement is unacceptable no matter who's doing the enslaving. And it's never ever acceptable no matter how benign the enslaver may be. So I want to put that in there, that we're pretty cognizant around here that, I don't care what sort of benign enslavement it was, enslavement is still unacceptable. Well, slavery proved to produce big profits in the Americas, particularly on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and South America, in the tobacco fields of North America. and also what became biggest cash crop, which was cotton. The demand for enslaved Africans grew for various different reasons, and eventually Spain and England got into the business of kidnapping and placing Africans in bondage. Africans became the choice for enslavement in various parts of the Americas and the Caribbean, because indigenous people in the Americas and the Caribbean were able to resist efforts to enslave them. They knew the terrain. That was their home. And so they were able to oftentimes run back to their communities. And also because of many of those peoples were decimated by the diseases that Europeans brought with them, notably smallpox, certain venereal diseases, things that they had no immunity to. They hadn't had contact with these folks. So they were, tribes were wiped out by disease that ran rampant through their people. So, according to the excellent reference, Africans in America, America's Journey Through Slavery, the arrival of Africans to the shores of North America was documented first in 1619, and Charleston, South Carolina became a major place for the importation of human beings. 11,000 Africans estimated, it could be more, a little bit less, but were imported through Sullivan's Island, which is now the site, so y'all know, of a very beautiful memorial ceremony that is held every year. Y'all can look that up. It's Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, and it is a reverence for the ancestors that were brought to those shores. It's beautiful. If you've ever seen the footage, you can find it on YouTube. Is something to know about, and if you can get there, that would be a beautiful thing for our people to be part of. Between 1735 to 1739, so that's a lot of folks, 11,000 people upwards brought ashore in that area. And many of those Africans were from Angola, which that fact is significant because among people who were importing and kidnapping Africans, Angolans had the reputation for being extremely hard to subdue. Troublemakers, if you will. And those Angolans created communities on the rice plantations outside Charleston and resented the bondage forced on them. And I think that can't be overstated. These are people who understood what it was to be free, and they understood what was being forced on them, and they didn't lay down for it. And one of those Angolans was a man called Jimmy. Now, I'm sure that's not the name that he was born with, but that is the name that has been recorded here for history. So that's what we're going to go with. And he decided to demand justice for his people. And very early on the morning of September 9th, 1739, Jimmy and 19 other enslaved people met on the banks of the Stono River, which is about 20 miles south of Charleston. And one of the things that they planned to do was escape to the Spanish, who were colonizing in Florida. And they were promising emancipation to fugitives from slavery if they could just get there. And it's important to note that the Spanish, of course, like all the colonizers, were not doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. They were at war with England, and wanted to find ways to destabilize the colonies in any way that they could. And one of the tactics that they used, and this was not the only time they would do this, if I'm not mistaken, you'll see them do it in what became Louisiana as well. But they promised emancipation to any Africans who could flee and get to them. And so that was something that was on Jimmy's mind and the mind of his, the folks that made up his little army. if they could get to Florida, they could get free. And it was a tactic, like I said, designed to disrupt the colonies, encourage rebellion among Africans in bondage. And once Jimmy and his soldiers reached Stono, they procured weapons by taking them from a store and killing the shopkeepers there. According to the Library of Congress, the rebels then raised a standard to shouts of liberty and the beating of drums. I would really, really, really love to have been able to see, the standard that they created and raised and marched under. It would have been dope. And the small band moved south towards Florida, and they were gathering black recruits and killing white opponents as they went. They reportedly did, on a couple of occasions at least, spare white enslavers who were known to not be super harsh with their enslaved people. So people that they saw as merciful, they didn't kill them. And the army grew to between 60 and 100 rebels, and was the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the British colonies prior to the American Revolution. We could go on all day about the ironies around that, but yeah. And the insurgents killed about 20 whites along their path to freedom. But eventually, and unfortunately, the Carolina militia surrounded the rebels in their camp, and they killed at that point at least 14 of those freedom fighters. And other insurgents who survived the attack and were able to flee back to the plantations that they had escaped were also murdered. And those that were rounded up and not killed outright were sold to enslavers in the Caribbean, because of course they were. So it's also my understanding that, with some of the rebels, the heads were placed on pikes as a warning which was also a common enslaver tactic when there was a rebellion, to mount body parts, usually heads, on pikes where other enslaved people could see them, as a warning to not, rebel. And it didn't work. So there's that. But they did do it. And the rebellion, I think it's important to know, yes, the rebellion was ended. And unfortunately, our man Jimmy and his people did not get the freedom that they were going after. But make no mistake, the inspiration that rebellion gave to enslaved people, that didn't go anywhere. That was something that was present, and I think that people kind of held that to their hearts. And naturally, the white establishment, reeling from the rebellion, because it rocked them. They were surprised. They were caught off guard. Because of racist beliefs about African intelligence, didn't see it coming. Can imagine why anyone would want to rebel. And so, acting out of shock and fear, they enacted much more restrictive and harsh measures to keep enslaved people under control. Community gatherings, the ability to read and write, freedom of movement became very heavily policed. Not like they had ever been free before, but the clamps came down and tightened on enslaved people's ability to move freely and gather. And even though the power structure offered folks some seeming concessions, like having some days, Sundays off, and reduced working hours at certain times of the year, Africans were still enslaved. That condition of servitude that was forced on people was not removed. The root cause was not addressed, which is a theme we will be coming back to this entire series, the roots of the rebellion, the fact that people were being held enslaved, held in bondage, that wasn't addressed. So it wasn't a matter of when, if there would be another uprising. It was a matter of when. And as we're going to cover in subsequent pieces, the spirit of freedom in African people who were held in bondage throughout the diaspora never abated. So we're not just talking about that spirit of dignity, that spirit of fighting for your right to live it, as a free human being. That wasn't something that was restricted to North America, where the places where people were enslaved in what became the United States. That was also a theme throughout the diaspora and also on the continent in dealing with European invaders. So yeah, that is the Stono Rebellion of 1739. Like I said, all of my source materials will be in the show notes, and I hope that you all will research them. I hope you'll add to them. I hope you will share what you learn with folks who may not know this history. And we're going to send up big power and love to Jimmy and all of his people who stood up and fought and paid the ultimate price for demanding their freedom and dignity. Peace to them, and thank you for joining.